Hi, I'm Deniz,
And I'm Tom.
and welcome to our podcast, Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
We created our podcast for you, our nonprofit colleagues. As nonprofit professionals with over 50 years of experience combined, we've led nonprofit hospitals, university programs, campaigns that have transformed cities, communities, and campuses. We're from Chicago and Detroit, and now we're in the Pacific Northwest. Our work has taken us across the country from the Midwest to Seattle, to Portland, California, and nationally. We've seen it, lived it, and have learned from it.
We've all been through a lot as nonprofit professionals, and we hear you, we see you, and we understand. We know you, too, are used to wearing many hats. It can be exhausting, but we come together with the shared mission to transform the world. Because We've Been in Your Shoes is a podcast for you, us, and our entire nonprofit community, sharing and learning from one another so we can continue to innovate and unleash capacity for good. We'll hear from colleagues and peers, discuss emerging issues in the sector, and provide you with key takeaways and useful tips to support you in all you do. We believe that people and philanthropy equal possibilities. Join us on the Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast with new topics and special guests. Hi, thanks and welcome to our episode of Because We've Been in Your Shoes. Tom, I think we really need to have the conversation about nonprofit and recruiting. Would love to maybe have an engagement of hearing your experiences and would love to share some of mine as well. I know we've both been through different recruiting experiences, whether it's private firms or directly from an organization, but I'm sure others out there would benefit from hearing from our own personal experiences. But what is your take on nonprofit recruiting today and the evolution of where we've come, especially given that you and I both have been in the field for over 20 years?
Let me just say first, I agree with you on, our experience that may be shared, right, with our colleagues, friends. I've heard many stories. I have friends that are actually in the field of recruitment, recruiting people. And I think for us, both of us, and more than likely our colleagues, we are recruiting as well. We're recruiting people for boards and to be employed by us and so forth. We're learning from our colleagues about what they've done, what they've learned. And as you mentioned before, we've been recruited or being recruited for positions. And over the years, I've seen many, many different things some of it has frustrated me and angered me. Some of it I've learned from and so forth. One of the things that has come up quite a bit in the last year, maybe year and a half, is ghosting. And I'll be honest with
I
you,
agree
I
with you.
didn't know. I didn't know what ghosting was. I honestly did not know what it was. So maybe I'm lucky or maybe I was naive. But then I had to actually look it up to find out what is ghosting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I will say, just being in this field, I didn't know what ghosting meant. Usually you would, recruiter would reach out to you and they would definitely not drop the ball. They would be kind of like, we really are interested in your background. Can I support you in your application process? We'd love to get you in front of the client. And we think you're a strong candidate, and really encourage through the process. Nowadays, I feel just they, dangle that carrot and like, are you interested? And then sometimes when you respond, it's crickets. You don't even hear back. And then you feel like,
Yep.
am I being overly annoying by constantly reaching out to that recruiter? Because, hey, you put it out there, I am interested. And so, yes, that ghosting was something new I learned as well. And I'd never experienced it until probably the last 2 years, really, since the pandemic. I just think it's either they are going through so many
Mm.
people, or there may be robotic process where there's a robot or something that's sending out these mass emails to people based on their, criteria. And so maybe it ends up being, going to an empty email address that no one's actually picking up. So I don't know what's happening.
I feel a little bit like I remember when I first got into development, and as we have our portfolios, we would go through 150, picking up the phone, emailing, trying to get appointments. And we were qualifying people, and then we moved them to the next stage, or we put them in the categories that no response or so forth. I feel like something like that has happened right now. I spoke to a number of my friends that are in the HR field and are actively recruiters, and they have mentioned some of the things you mentioned. And that is, yes, it's a lot less people doing it. It's overwhelming. They're trying to get back to people and so forth. But I think also that's an excuse, because I feel what you just said made me think about something. And that is, well, if you're being intentional, that means you go after maybe 5 to 10 people a week, maybe, I don't know. You do something like that and you respond and you follow up, and then you communicate to these people and let them know, look, this is not the right fit. We're going to move forward. And even that, the not the right fit, is questionable as well. But somehow it needs to be something coming back to you, some type of communications. And unfortunately, you're left in the dark, so you're left wandering.
Yeah, and you almost question, wait, was I imagining they were interested in me?
Hmm.
Sometimes I've actually been through, many years ago, I went through a national recruiter that they're not just dedicated to the nonprofit space. They work also in government positions as well as particularly private sector companies. And so, they're pretty large. They have different industries that they're representing, but the process that I went through was, I felt like I was their number one candidate. I went through 3 intense interview stages just with the firm, not even yet interacting with the client. And, I thought I was gonna be, presented in a way that, "Hey, client A, we have these candidates. We're gonna lean into really showing you these top 3, and this is why." And my understanding, I would have been in one of those, and it felt like I was gonna have that initial interview with the client, with their client. And unfortunately, I waited 2, 3 weeks, heard nothing. And then at what point, does somebody say, "Okay, should I reach out to the recruiter? It's been about 3 weeks." What is that normal timeline? So when I reached out, I waited, another week had gone by, I heard nothing, and this was a position that would relocate me and my family, so I was seriously thinking about it, and then I did another outreach, and then finally on that second prompt, then they're like, "Oh, my apology, the client did not wanna move forward with your application." And for me, I still think of that moment. It was a true disconnect in terms of the way I felt supported by the recruiter and then all of a sudden dropped as if I didn't even matter.
Hmm.
And those kind of experiences sit with you. And so
Yep.
now when I get a call from a recruiter, I'm very cautious and really making sure I know who the recruiter is. I'm having to do more homework in finding out why you're reaching out to me. Who are you? How effective are you? What is the, experience others have had with you as a recruiter? Because it's a lot for anybody to be dangled an opportunity. And then you go through that thought process. How could I relocate to that? Is that going to be a real career shift for me? Is that a great opportunity? You invest in all of that time and then to feel ghosted is
Agreed.
quite demoralizing.
Agreed. Interesting enough, I would add another point to what you said. I would probably now ask the question to the recruiter, how many people do you have in your pool? I
Great
would probably
question.
want to know that, because I feel a little bit like if this person says, well, we're just out there casting a wide net, more than likely I'm going to now want to pull out. But if they said, look, we're going to connect to the top, I don't know, 10, 25, I'm making these numbers up. But what makes you feel comfortable that you feel that at least there's going to be some type of return communications to you? So, what is that number? I don't know what that number is for anyone out there, but that's something I've decided I'm going to ask. The other thing I keep thinking about is sometimes I'm sure you've seen this, and we've all gotten this. We start receiving emails. Somehow we get into a database and we begin getting those emails. And there's a moment of who are you? And I think part of us want to keep those emails because we think, oh, we don't know what the future will look like. But you know what I've done now? Anytime I get an email without a connection, without some kind of outreach, I delete it and I block it right away.
Wow. Wow,
I've
okay.
decided that's how I'm going to move forward with it. Yep, I've been doing that now. From now on, I need to know, how serious are you, company? Did you go through LinkedIn, see my name, and just add me to your database? Or Are you reaching out to me to find out a little bit more about me, what my interests are, maybe where do I want to live in the world, and then connect me to your database. But too many times emails are coming in where sometimes I go to myself, wait, who's this company?
Yeah.
Why? So now I just delete it and I block them.
Yeah, it's different too, so traditional research firms or, excuse me, recruiting firms, that's one thing. Then, you think about I don't really get as many inbound inquiries from a large organization's HR team either. So I know increasingly they are outsourcing that. So I back in the day, I used to get a call from X, Y, and Z hospital or X, Y, and Z university would call me directly. It would be their HR person saying, we're very interested in what you've done. We pay attention to you in the community. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And that has been my experience, pretty early on, especially in earlier part of like the 2000s. And that's kind of gone. I don't think many people, those HR teams, I don't think they're doing direct recruiting in those organizations. I think they're outsourcing a lot of them. And I think that's even a step further away from the candidate having an interaction with the organization. And so, because we don't have that interaction with the organization from the onset, I think it's
Mm.
more challenging for us to really get a sense of like, okay, well, I also need to know what the organization's about, why you see me as a great candidate for your client. What does that look like? And I feel like oftentimes we don't even get the chance to ask a lot of those questions. The recruiters will just say, well, this is the position. If you're interested, submit it online. If you're not interested, share it with your network or I'll move on. And so we don't even get a chance as to, well, what am I applying for? Exactly what is the job? What is the culture of the organization? How am I able to envision myself being a part of addressing a need they have, solving a problem? How can I add impact to that organization? And oftentimes, you get so distant away from the potential employer that I think the recruiting process doesn't work for every candidate either.
I have to agree with you. Something you said again that kind of let me go, oh, wait a minute. Not wait a minute, but there were two organizations that reached out to me directly, nothing in between. It was an email of introduction, and then they wanted to meet with me. Just let's have a conversation over the phone. I immediately connected to those organizations. And I
Oh,
think that's
that's great.
amazing that these people, these organizations, and let me just say one is Dartmouth. They reached out to me directly. And I thought that was amazing, and I want to compliment them for doing that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, some organizations go through, as you mentioned, a consultant or something like that, and some are really good at it. I have to admit that there are at least one or two that made the contact through this a consultant company, and they followed up. They immediately got me connected to the leaders within the organizations. That was really good. But the majority of them, as we've been talking, what this discussion is about, is the ghosting,
Yeah.
how you're in their database, they're not following up, and you almost sense what they're doing. They're just building up the numbers, um, and then eventually, when they find a fit, they may reach back out to you. But how many people are sitting in their database right now?
Yeah.
It's not intentional, and
Yeah.
that's the challenge I have with them. I was talking to a good friend of mine that will be on this podcast. He's an HR professional, been in the field for years, and he's spoken to me about being ghosted. And this is a person in the field, and he's talked to me about that. We've had a long discussion where he felt like yourself. You got to the next level, you keep moving up, and all of a sudden, nothing. And
Yeah.
he was really surprised about what happened. So, again, look, we all know the reality of what's happening right now in our world. A number of people are leaving the industry, many industries. Could that be it? Yes and no. I feel that you have to worry about your reputation. And that means if I'm a recruiter for a company, I'm going to do the best I can to follow up and to communicate and let those people know. Because what if someone is waiting for, they think this is the company I really want to work for, this organization. They're waiting and they're giving up other opportunities.
Yeah. I definitely hear you. And I definitely also see that those recruiting firms need to be also maybe upfront about, when we say 3 internal interviews before we present you to a client, they need to be very transparent as to what the timeline is too, because as a candidate,
Mm,
you're investing not just your time, you're actually investing a lot of your thought, your energy, your excitement and hope. And then it helps you also assess, what am I doing at my current job? Or, what have I done in the past that I don't want to repeat that opportunity again? I want to explore a different path. Um, so when you invest
mm.
in your time in yourself to be able to go through that, thought process and envisioning, oh, I could potentially live in this community now, impacting this kind of work, and it helps me broaden my career path. But when you go through that personal investment and the recruiter just kind of drops you, it just is, it's really hard because in some cases, if you really were investing in being a part of that candidate pool, being a part of having a conversation with that potential employer and not having that chance, it can be, heartbreaking
Yep.
in some ways. At least for me, I've wanted positions, and honestly, I've been through around 2 and 3 sometimes, with the potential employer, and the recruiter is supposed to be the go-between, right? And I'll wait 2 or 3 weeks, and honestly, I had something very similar not too long ago where I was told I was the finalist, and 3 weeks go by, I send
Mm.
another email, don't hear back. Another week goes by, and, it took an extra 2 weeks. By the time the recruiter contacted me, I had already resolved that that wasn't a path for me. They weren't respective of my time, wouldn't communicate, if I'm a finalist, then I would like to know. So, when she called back, I was like, I'm sorry, I've moved on. I am pursuing other opportunities. And so that's also another example of, you can lose somebody really great as a candidate, but timeliness, responsiveness, the courtesy of being really communicative about what that process is, so that your potential candidate is not, or your finalist is not like, I give up, and I think it goes both ways. But oftentimes I'm seeing they're being stretched thin. There's a lot of applicants out there. They're all pursuing the same opportunities. But what I would love to know, and we'll talk to your friend, and I think this is a series that we'll like to have 2 or 3 more episodes dedicated to this ghosting and recruiting, to hear from others and to hear from recruiters themselves, to invite them to see, what does that mean? What can you tell a candidate in that process? Is it so hush hush that, can you be transparent that you've now moved into a candidate pool where there's 6 of you, or there's 2 of you? Like, what does that process look like? What can a potential candidate ask in the recruiting process? I mean, I still don't know, after many, many years of working with recruiters. I don't even know if I'm crossing I'm making them disclose something that they're not ready to disclose. Like, okay, well, if you've got 3 candidates, what does that timeline look like? Can I get a sense as to an expectation of when I can hear you, when I can expect they'd like to have their finalist start? And if that hiring process goes smoothly, you know, if I'm going to relocate my family, give me a better timeline. And I don't know if it's unique to the nonprofit recruiting examples and experiences, but I can tell you, I've spoken to a lot of colleagues over the years across the country that a lot of them just feel ghosted
Yeah.
more and more so lately than ever before. And even with the qualifications and the background that they have, they're not getting those first interviews.
I agree. There is part of me that asks the question, the responsibilities for the company that hired these recruiting companies. What are they doing? What does that process look like? How often are they checking up on those organizations? Why did they do that? Is it just they don't have the time? Which then I have a question about that. Because if these positions are so important and you're telling me you don't have the time to really sit down and recruit on your own, I got to question that a little bit. Again, what's the follow up? What are you doing? How are you checking with them? Are you getting to see all the listing of people they're bringing through? And I know what organizations will say. We don't have time for this. We want to see the top 10, and then we're going to whittle that down. Well, maybe you need to make the time. This is going to be an important position for you. Companies and organizations, you have to be intentional about it. I keep thinking about what decisions are being made about this position. Are the expectations extremely clear on what you want this position to do? Are they clear with the organization you're working with? I'll give you an experience. Several years ago, we brought in the company to do some recruiting for us. We made it very clear diversity was important to us.
Mhm.
And the results of the top three candidates, none of us could believe what they brought in. None of us. And I remember I said to that company, you should have shown us maybe the top eight. That way we would have seen the work you were doing. But you brought in three people that didn't fit all of our
Exactly.
qualifications. So that was a real problem right there.
Wow.
So again, what are their expectations? How often are you meeting with this company to make sure they're following through? You know, a lot of these organizations are throwing out the word DEI as they think about recruitment, but when you pass this stuff off to another company, are you following through to make sure that they are following your mission and your value, your expectations? Uh, and I'm going to say that
Yeah.
some organizations are going so fast, they're not slowing down to think about those things. And I think that's very, very important. I've actually had a
Yeah.
conversation, I'm going to say probably about a year out with one organization where the team itself never met any of the candidates. The team never met the candidates that they were going to be, that was going to be over them, supervising them. How is that possible?
I have heard that, and I have actually been in that process where I've, asked to, well, how many team members do we actually have for this position? And I can tell you, I have run the opposite direction when they don't have the colleagues that this position would be managing and supervising, and collaborating with daily. You have to build trust as a candidate with whatever that team, whoever makes up that team. And I think that's actually a failure on the recruiter's part, um, with their client. Let's say it's a hospital or university, for example, or a large nonprofit. I think the problem is organizations that say they just want diverse candidate pool, are they equitably transforming their hiring process to support and be mindful of
Mm,
how they're recruiting? How are they supporting candidates through? So you can then, maybe in this case that you didn't see that, I think if you lead with an equity mindset into your hiring process and practice, you have to align it to see where the organization is with that journey and what does that look like. And sometimes recruiters don't even have that kind of experience because they're not immersed in a cultural organization, let's say, that has done a lot of that work. And so sometimes I find that it's the recruiter isn't the good match for that client to help them find those more
mm,
experienced, diverse, and more inclusive experience for the recruiting process. So they don't necessarily always produce clients or candidates, excuse me, to the client that as is meeting their checkbox of what they're looking for. And yes, I agree with you. If an organization is asking to see the different resumes that come in through the door, that's where also I have been through the process. And yes, I've hired a firm and I've been through the process where we went through a firm and we stopped it because the firm wasn't doing anything. And then about a year and a half ago, I actually was in a position to build a team from scratch. And in building that team, I actually did my own research on the candidates I wanted. And I reached out to their backgrounds, and they just happen to be amazing leaders in their space. Some are rising leaders, but they have diverse backgrounds, culturally diverse as well. And the experience and the feedback I got from those colleagues, they felt the hiring process was meaningful on both sides. They felt comfortable. They appreciated the continuity and consistent feedback and communication I gave them to carry them through. Even though I was the hiring manager, I was very much involved in making sure those are the candidates I'd like. I want to be open and sharing with them how they're doing. But the candidates I had to turn down, I was available to them to explain to them why we went with another candidate. And still said, if there are other opportunities, and I mean it, within the organization, I would lean back into your application and see if there's an opportunity that aligns with your skills. And I think I did that because I've been in that position. And I'm like, well, I want to treat others the way I would like to be treated in the recruiting process. And so I think organizations that kind of apply that model tend to have really great candidates in the process and end up having, as a result, I hired two of my best hires were without a recruiter, that I identified and approached them individually. And it goes back to, a little bit about the way it was, at least for me, in the early 2000s, was where people were calling me specifically like, hey, we've noticed you in the community. We've seen the great work you've done. We've got an opportunity that we'd love to talk to you about. And that always feels great. I mean, I will tell you, I was in Detroit, then I presented in Chicago, and I had a recruiter, well, not recruiter, it was actually an employee, here at the hospital here in Portland, and she saw me present. And afterwards, she said, I'm going to be building my team. I would love to talk to you. We need a grateful patient fundraising model. What you presented is this is the direction we'd love to go, and we want to build our team. Would you be open to having a conversation? And, at first I was like, sure. I don't know anything about Portland. I didn't think of, relocating at the time, but they individually brought me through the process, flew me out twice to make sure that I also this is a big move for me across the country. And that was a very positive experience. But that colleague, she's no longer there, but she was, another major gift officer that knew exactly, the kind of skill sets, the needs that she had, and the kind of opportunity that her team had for someone like me. And so while it took us 4 months, both sides, myself and the organization, I think were very careful and thoughtful. And so that was probably one of the best ones that I experienced. And so I usually use those examples to apply in how I approach recruiting. Granted, I'm not a recruiting expert, but I do know how to build teams. And I've been through the recruiting experience, so I lean into those. But
Hmm.
I know that we're going to be talking to people who are skilled and do this every day to shed some more light in the process. And I think you and I both agree there are some really great recruiters out there. There are great firms, people who really care about supporting candidates from the beginning, and even if they don't make it, circling back with them. But then you and I have both experienced there's this increase and rise of people moving into the field of recruiting, or they're kind of independent and they're saying, oh, I can hire and find you the next talent. And then they may not have that experience. And I think that's where we're also seeing more and more ghosting happening.
Hmm.
But I do want to share, and this will probably be another episode, but I have heard on the other side recruiters saying that candidates are ghosting them.
Yes, I recently heard that as well. I was surprised a little bit only because I thought I was hearing so much from one side, thinking that people are desperate for jobs and they really want to work and so forth. So when I heard from the other side, I was a little surprised, a little shocked. I think part of me wanted to deny that could be happening, but I couldn't. I knew that that's really happening. I'm not sure, what's worse on either side. The facts are the ghosting part is bad no matter what side it's on, right? Not being able to communicate.
Oh,
And the
yeah,
other thing about it are people thinking about their own reputation. I brought that up earlier before, but the organization's reputation. When you begin to ghost people, guess what? We're going to share that among our colleagues, friends. It hasn't got to the point yet where we're putting it on LinkedIn saying, don't work with this company, don't work with this individual, but we talk among ourselves. And so when
definitely.
something like this happens and someone asks me a question about a company that may be questionable, I'm going to tell them this is what my experience has been. I'm not saying you should go with them or not, but this has been my experience
Definitely.
and so forth. In fact, there is one or two companies actually I have a little book and I wrote the names of the company. I'm like, I will not work with these two companies again
I have a
based on some
couple
of my
of those
experience.
too,
Yep.
Tom. I think we're in the same. There's a couple that, I've been through the process and I'm in their database. I get a call pretty much every other week. Not every other week, but I'll get a call a few times a year from the same firm.
Hmm.
And oftentimes, um, I'm like, did you look in your database and see how far I went with the other one? I don't know why all of a sudden I'm looking at animal advocacy organizations and you see my background there. And then you see me in a government policy opportunity. Like, it's just kind of like, is
Hmm.
it just because she's solid enough, we'll just push her through and we're not actually going to get her in front of the candidate? So, yes, I get from the same organization, I'll get a variety of positions and a variety of areas within the nonprofit space. And I always wonder, are they just pulling first out of their database? Are they really trying to align with the organization's wish list as to the kind of experience they're looking for? Or
Hmm.
do they just kind of, as a CFRE, do they just look at the certified fundraising executive or the CAP, advisor in philanthropy? Are they just looking at certain things
Hmm.
and then they just push people? I mean, we'll find out when we speak to some recruiters that we're going to have on later, but it's fascinating to me to see how we, as a
Yeah.
sector, have experienced recruiting at different levels in our careers and how others are experiencing that are new into the nonprofit space because there's so many recruiters, independent, small firms,
Hmm.
large, national, and global firms. And it's kind of can be confusing as to, is the recruiter going to advocate for my salary package? Do I negotiate with them? How do I know that they're going to get me the best process? And so the other thing is like, I think recruiters that are great present to you, and I'm going to carry you so far through the process that I'm going to help you with the negotiation. And so it's like, are you just going to feed what the client wants? Or are you going to be able to support your candidate
Yep.
in their relocation package or their salary needs, their benefit needs? What does that look like? And oftentimes recruiters, you know, as an independent candidate, it's like, well, can the recruiter help me with the negotiations or do I go directly back to my new potential employer and to a team you haven't even built a rapport with through that process?
Hmm.
So that's also
Hmm.
another area would love to start asking some of the guests we're going to have what their experience is and what they can tell our audience
Yeah.
as to what to expect in that recruiting process.
I agree. Some of the things I want to ask future guests. Number one, as a recruiter, are you helping and training the hiring person or company to make sure they're asking the right questions, to make sure that they're ready to do the correct process that needs to happen? Are you training with that person? Are you providing the guidance? Uh, in some of the things I've been through, no. Secondly, I would love to know if this is a bad thing. And this, I remember where people would come back to me and ask me for advice. They went through the process, they didn't get the job, and they would come back and ask me. And I always said, yes, let's meet and let's talk about. Here are some things we saw. Here are some things uh, that I would advise that you do, say, don't say, something like that. I've asked a couple of my HR friends, and they said they would never do that. I'm like, tell me why. They said, well, you start building these long-term relationships. You may go into areas that may be dangerous. I don't know what any of that means. So I think I would love to have that person with professional background to share with us. Why wouldn't you, after an interview, share with that person, here's what you did well. Here's some things you can improve upon. What's wrong with that? Maybe there is something wrong with that, but I would love to chat with someone about that. I think about other questions. I go back to expectations.
Oh,
If
expectations. Yeah.
I am going to be the hiring manager, or I'm going to work with an organization that's going to do the recruitment, are we sitting down together and having clear expectations and meeting weekly if this position is so important? Maybe weekly is too much. I don't think it is. Maybe it's just me. But those are some questions I would love to talk to someone who is a professional recruiter, HR person.
Yeah, and the other thing I think what we'll definitely dive into for those of you listening and stay tuned for future episodes is really looking at the technology and the database process of how they cull through those keywords in your resume. And I know LinkedIn is also very much a huge tool. People just only look for jobs on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably, I think a lot of recruiters use it heavily. Independent or large firms, it seems to be that's where most of the inbound that I'm getting. Sometimes I get, directly in my email, but largely I'm getting inbound from LinkedIn. And so, but what if you're not on LinkedIn? I know a lot of colleagues, I mean, reality, social media and LinkedIn is, well, it's a professional networking. It's, that's a whole nother topic, I think, in of itself. But I think, I don't always stay up to date on, what I'm doing on LinkedIn is not, I'm usually busy working. I don't really have time to always update my profile or engage in different topics and conversations through LinkedIn. And so would love to also ask some of those future guests that we have planned from the recruiting world to share with us how that as a tool has shaped and changed, especially for the nonprofit sector.
Mm.
And then especially as the convenience of using the technology, maybe that's also what contributes to the ghosting because they're reaching out to maybe 300 candidates in that initial round. And would love to know, how did they get from 300, prospective candidates down to the one? To be able to have someone walk us through and share with that, I think our listeners and audience would benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Great points.
Well, based on that conversation, or based on our conversation and our plans to continue this, we hope you'll join us as we're continue talking about ghosting, the recruiting process, and I think we can just go on and on about this. But I know,
Agreed.
Tom, you've got some special guests we're going to hear from, and
That's right. That's right. And let me just say, we would love to hear from you also, audience. Please respond. Let us know what have been your experience. What tips can you provide? What recommendations do you have that can help other people that are listening to this as they're getting ready to either start the process of looking for a job, or maybe recruiters are starting the process to recruit? What tips can you give? Share with us, please.
yeah, be sharing a little bit more about how people can reach out to us. But if you've got a compelling story, we'd love to hear you and possibly have a chance to have you be a part of our podcast in the future, especially those nonprofit colleagues that are working in this space and experiencing this regularly. Would love to hear what their experience has been.
That's right. Because we've all been in each other's shoes.
Yes, because we've been in your shoes and we know through experience, and we also learn from exchanging our own stories and what that's been like for each other. So thank you. And until then, Tom, I'll see you later.
Take care. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
Join us next time as we share, advocate, and highlight experiences and ideals from nonprofit colleagues, leaders, and champions.
Subscribe to Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast and be the first to hear our new episodes introducing new topics and guest speakers. Remember, nonprofit friends, you're not alone because we've been in your shoes.